Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. It's Eric Lesser here for Lunchtime with Lesser. We have a very exciting show today or interview today. We are turning the mic around because I'm usually a guest on his program and have been for a couple of years. We're here with Bishop Talbert Swan. Bishop Swan wears a lot of hats in the community. He's, of course, a bishop and a community leader in Springfield, also a national leader in his denomination that we'll talk about in a little bit, and also has a very important role as the head of the Greater Springfield NAACP. So very timely time to have you on. And just personally, as a guest on your show, now I'm excited to turn it around here and ask you some questions. But Bishop Swan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's going to be interesting with you doing the interview instead of me, but I'm here for it.
I promise it'll be a friendly interview. So, so first, thank you so much for joining. I want to jump right into a really urgent issue that's been in the news a lot. We've got a lot of topics to cover, but one of the most urgent for right now and for the health of our communities is the vaccine access and vaccine equity. I think we all saw and watched, frankly, with horror, the situation at the Eastfield Mall earlier this week when seniors were left in the cold for hours in some cases to get their vaccine. Wanted to just ask you, your thoughts on this, and also what the state needs to be doing to keep vaccine distribution as equitable as possible.
Yeah, so my wife and I were actually out and about on a rare occurrence on Monday because it was our 30th anniversary.
Happy anniversary. I saw a great post, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And
you're showing us up. I'm gonna have to remember that for my anniversary.
And we happened to ride over by the Eastfield Mall, and I'm looking and I'm saying, what are all these people out here for? And then I realized it was for the vaccine site. And I mean, they were wrapped all around the building outside. I said, this is absolutely crazy. I think the advertisement I saw on your page that talked about how in Eastern Massachusetts, they've got Gillette Stadium, they've got Fenway Park, and we've got a closed down Macy's out here in the largest city in Western Massachusetts. I think it's indicative of the attitude of Boston politicians when it comes to Western Mass, that we're often left out in the cold, an afterthought. Even prior to the vaccine coming out, they had COVID response teams that were passing out PPE equipment. They were giving information on how to stop the spread all throughout Eastern Mass, and had forgotten about Western Mass until we finally prevailed upon them. And they wound up having two teams. I led one of the teams, and Zaida Luna, former city councilor, led a team in the North End. But even then, they had us working every other week instead of every week like all the other teams in Eastern Mass. So for some reason, no matter how much we beat the door down and tell them don't forget about us in Western Massachusetts, we're often the stepchild of the Commonwealth. And I think that the governor and his team have to do a much better job on being responsive to the needs in Western Massachusetts, because we pay our taxes here. Yep. We're residents of the Commonwealth, and as you said, we deserve better.
Yeah, I mean, it really is shocking. I mean, and you saw it with your own eyes. When I went over to the Eastfield Mall, this was on Wednesday after those reports, to just take a tour. I was struck, as you said, by just the sort of remoteness of how they seem to have it all set up. There was no doctor there, as far as I could tell, and they have thousands of people coming in and out being administered shots. There was no one from the Department of Public Health. I mean, I frankly find it shocking that they can't send somebody 90 miles down the highway to just keep an eye on things while it's open during the day. They were relying on a contractor who was from out of state and didn't really seem to have a lot of familiarity with the local community.
And the mayor was talking about calling in the National Guard.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it was ultimately, I do give the mayor credit for sounding the alarm on that. And I met and said hi to a couple of those National Guard members. But, I think it's worth pointing out for people that the state is paying this contractor to administer these vaccines. They dropped the ball, to put it mildly. And
Yeah.
now our guardsmen and women are the ones doing it, and they're still getting paid, I think. I mean, it just seems to be a very unfair situation. I want to kind of bring into this another element of the vaccine inequity, certainly the regional disparity, but there's also growing concerns about the racial disparity in the vaccine distribution. There was a lot of attention on the Reggie Lewis Center in Boston, which was a mass vaccination site, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood where the site is located. It was, in many reasons, intentionally put in that community to give access to those community members. And then there were a lot of photos and a lot of reports circulating in the Boston media that almost all the people in line, at least in the early days, were white and were from surrounding neighborhoods that had driven in to get the vaccine. Can you talk a little bit, Bishop, about this and about the concerns here and what the state needs to do to be more proactive?
Yeah, we had the same phenomenon at the Eastfield Mall.
Right.
Matter of fact, the gentleman who was managing that site happened to be African American, and one of the concerns he expressed was the fact that he saw so few African Americans coming to the site and setting up appointments to be vaccinated. I think one of the major issues is that the state has done a poor job in terms of engaging Black communities across the state. I've been on national calls and platforms with the Biden administration, with national clergy groups, to really engage our community and talk to our community about the importance of the vaccine, especially in light of the historical distrust between the Black community and the medical establishment,
Right.
for obvious reasons. Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee experiment, those types of things still linger in the memories of Black America. And when you talk about the disparities that exist in every other area of health, it's no wonder that there are many Black people that are reticent to take a vaccine. And the first thing the state ought to be doing is trying to engage stakeholders and leaders and voices that people in the Black community trust to talk about the vaccine. They're not doing that.
Right.
You know, I happen to be, one of the leading religious figures in Western Massachusetts. I've heard nothing from the state. They haven't approached me. They haven't approached my colleagues in the Pastors Council or the Council of Churches or anyone in the Black community in terms of trying to engage trusted voices to get our people to go out and get the vaccine. And if they're not going to start out with education, we're going to see exactly what we saw at the Reggie Lewis Center.
Right.
A center opened in the heart of the Black community, but is not providing services for the Black community because the government is not engaging the Black community.
Is the whole way the state is approaching this right now kind of wrong, especially when you think about these concerns you're raising about trusted voices in the community really being at the front of promoting the vaccine? One of the alternative approaches, right, instead of having the Eastfield Mall or the Reggie Lewis Center, is you have community health centers.
Yes.
You have senior centers, you have community organizations, maybe even churches themselves being smaller scale vaccination sites. People can walk, people can go with a neighbor, they can go with a trusted community leader. Is that really it feels to me like maybe that would be a more effective approach,
Yeah.
right? Rather than this sort of herd mentality of get everybody into Gillette Stadium or get everybody into Fenway Park. That feels it feels to me like a smaller scale approach is going to be better.
Yeah, and the dynamics of our communities are much different. The social scientists will tell you that Black people are relational people. It's like Black children learn differently than white children. The reality is, if a Black child doesn't have a good relationship with their teachers, it's difficult for them to learn. That's why we often hear them say, "My teacher doesn't like me," and when they think their teacher doesn't like them, it's hard for them to learn from them. Same thing exists in this dynamic. Um, uh, People in the Black community, they trust their church, they trust their community center. Um, they have a level of trust in certain organizations and people, and if you engage those organizations and people, you're more likely to get a better response from the community. So if we were having vaccinations done at the Dunbar Community Center
Right.
or at the MLK Center or at the Springfield Boys and Girls Club Family Center or at the various churches in our community, I guarantee you, you would see a higher percentage of our people who would be coming out to get vaccinated because they would feel like they have a level of trust in the people who are opening up their doors.
Yeah, very, very important feedback, urgent, really feedback, because we do know that one of the only ways we're going to get out of this pandemic is by having everyone participate in the
I mean, the
vaccination.
reality is they say that in order to get to herd immunity, we've got to have 70% of the population that is vaccinated. You can't get there with only vaccinating a high percentage of the white population.
Right.
They still don't get to 70%. So if you don't get a high enough percentage of African Americans vaccinated, we never will get to that threshold.
Exactly. So I want to pivot a little bit. We could certainly talk all day about that, but I want to pivot to something that's been in the news recently, which was a pretty scary incident in Longmeadow. There was a meeting of the Longmeadow Anti-Racism Committee. It was over Zoom, and I guess this is a new term we've all learned in the last year. But there was a Zoom bomb. A person hacked into the meeting, scribbled swastikas and racial epithets in red ink across the screen, and then also verbally, made some very obviously very racist. It was a hate crime, frankly, conducted over Zoom. It got a lot of attention in the media. I wanted to ask you about this a little bit, and your thoughts and reactions to this, and what community leaders and what really all of us need to do to be more vigilant about this in the future.
Yeah, it's indicative of the day and the time that we live in. Racial tensions are high. The nation is racially polarized. We're going through the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, who for 4 years exacerbated race relations in this nation. And so it's not a surprise that rabid racists and immature folks are doing things like this. I had this happen to me once upon a time, and we learned how to set our Zoom platform up where there would be a waiting room. Folks couldn't get into the room to do any Zoom bombing if we didn't let them in, and we could immediately expel them from the room. And so, it's sad that you have to go through those types
Yeah.
of things
Yeah.
in order to just have a meeting. But yeah, this is the day and the age that we live in. And so to break into that meeting and hurl racial epithets aimed at Black folks at the Jewish community is reprehensible behavior. And I'm hopeful that law enforcement will be able to track down the culprits and they'll be held to account for it. But we've got to be vigilant in fighting against racism, against white supremacy. The reality is, Christopher Wray said probably 6 months or so ago, and it was
The
completely
FBI
ignored.
director, right? Just to Chris Wray, the FBI director. Yep.
Yes, and it was completely ignored by the Department of Justice
Right.
that the greatest terrorist threat in America were white supremacists.
Right.
And that's what we face even today. And I'm hopeful that the new administration will kind of reprioritize, take the focus off so-called Black identity extremists,
Right.
off of immigrants and Muslims and others, and refocus their efforts on really tracking down and destroying these white supremacist cells that exist all over our nation, and get these hate crimes down to a manageable level.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out too, Massachusetts in particular and our own community in Western Mass and in the greater Springfield area has seen a marked increase in hate crimes and in attempted hate crimes. And this has been documented by the Anti-Defamation League. It's been documented by the governor's hate crimes task force, that have kept track of police reports and incident reports from around the state. I just wanted to, while we're on this topic, there were some other high profile incidents of this. There was, of course, the church fire in Springfield just a few weeks ago. And before that, there was an incident of a anti-Semitic arson attempt at the Jewish nursing home. Is this, can you, yeah, I mean, I think, we've kind of talked about the broader cases in our community. What can we be doing? People might be watching this and they share the outrage at these incidents and these crimes. I mean, they're crimes that have happened around our community. What can people be doing kind of in their own lives right now and in their own kind of circles to fight this?
Yeah, see, none of these incidents happen in a vacuum.
Right.
Individuals who create these heinous or engage in these heinous acts are someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's nephew, someone's grandchild. They grew up in someone's home. They were radicalized in some kind of way in order for them to think it's a good idea to burn a nursing home, a Jewish nursing home where elderly people reside, or to burn down a Black church. And so I think the onus is on us to challenge racist ideologies wherever they exist, to challenge anti-Semitism wherever it exists. And we see it all the time. We see it at the Thanksgiving dinner table, talking amongst our relatives. We see it amongst our friends as they're telling the racist joke. We see it around the water cooler on our jobs as people are casually talking, and those things that we think are just harmless jokes or pranks. Those are the things that give you an indication into the mindset of an individual and eventually escalate into something far more serious. And I think we've got to report incidents like that. We've got to challenge people who speak like that or who share ideas or ideologies like that. Each and every one of us has a responsibility to challenge racism, anti-Semitism, wherever we see it. And here's the thing. Oftentimes people say, I'm not racist. There's no such thing as not racist. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. Because if you're not fighting against white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Black bigotry, then you are complicit in its continuation.
I want to move now. We've got a few minutes left, but I want to move to another issue that we've worked on together, and that was a major topic of debate and discussion over the summer, into the fall, into the winter, which is the police reform. And I want to start maybe by talking about Springfield, and then we'll talk about the broader state level reforms. But I know that there's been a lot of activity recently around a consent decree with the Springfield Police. Can you talk a little bit about what this current situation is and what the kind of current state of efforts are there?
Yeah, the DOJ report came out in July.
Right.
We have been advocating, of course, for police reform for many, many, many years. But when it comes to this particular report, we've been trying to hold the city accountable to implement the recommendations of the DOJ. The NAACP and the Pioneer Valley Project sent a Freedom of Information request trying to see what has been implemented by the city. The city prolonged its response, and when we finally got a response, there was nothing in their response letter that was germane to the recommendations of the DOJ. When it comes to the state police reform, the commissioner admitted she has no idea how to implement it. Our first problem, of course, is that the police commissioner is the wrong person to implement any changes, since all of this stuff happened under her watch or when she was in leadership in the department. She has said in public meetings that there's not a problem with police brutality, and in the last public forum that the mayor had, she said she doesn't see a problem with systemic racism. So if we have a police commissioner that doesn't think there's police brutality, that doesn't think there's systemic racism, how in the world is she going to implement changes that are necessary to stop police brutality and systemic racism within the department? And so we feel like the only way that the city is really going to move toward any substantive police reform is for the DOJ to implement a consent decree that will mandate that the city do certain things, and that will be monitored as well, because on its own, it has proven that it doesn't have the fortitude to make the necessary changes.
Yeah, for people who might not have followed all of the details of this, I really do encourage everyone to read the DOJ report that Bishop Swan is referring to. Just as some background here, the Federal Department of Justice out of Washington did a what's called a pattern and practice investigation on the Springfield police, and they found that the Springfield Narcotics Bureau had engaged in a pattern and practice of abuse and excessive force. And there are very particular examples of it delineated in the report. I found it so compelling, frankly. I read portions of it on the floor of the Senate during our police reform debate this summer. And I think it's worth pointing out for people that this was, I believe, the only report of its kind issued by the Trump Justice Department, which was not exactly known as being tough on law enforcement. And so if that isn't a wake-up call for the need for urgent reforms, you frankly wonder what is. I want to kind of now move that to the state level conversation about both the role that the DOJ report played in the advocacy for the state level reforms, and also maybe what we need to keep an eye on as those reforms come online. This is the new certification program statewide for police, the banning of chokeholds, the banning of racial profiling. Can you talk a little bit about what we need to keep our eyes on there?
Yeah, the fight for state reforms was long, and it was arduous. It was difficult, but we finally got to a point where legislation was passed that is now being touted as the most sweeping reforms in the nation. What remains to be seen is how these changes are actually implemented.
Right. Exactly.
I think one of the important components of this is the certification of police. When you look at other professions, my son's a barber, he has to be certified by the state. Electricians have to be certified by the state.
Lawyers, doctors, nurses.
Doctors, exactly. But for years and years, police did not have to be certified. And police, in many cases, got training that was less comprehensive than, say, a barber. A barber actually has to go through more hours of training than a police officer who holds your life and death in their hands. And so a state certification process is critical, first of all, to ensure that everyone meets a certain minimal standard. But then I think more importantly is when you do have complaints against police officers, if they are not handled properly on the local level. Case in point, here in Springfield, when the Nathan Bill incident happened, right, the Internal Investigations Unit did nothing. The district attorney prosecuted no one, and it had to finally go to the state attorney general, and all of a sudden 14 officers are being indicted and prosecuted.
All of a sudden they discovered that the ATM machine next door had a 24-hour camera that recorded.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And if these officers had gone through a certification process and citizens were able to make complaints that went to the state, and the state did investigations, because you don't have to be indicted for a crime to be investigated. Some of these folks could have been decertified a long time before it ever got to this point. One of the officers in the DOJ report that is mentioned, Officer Greg Bigda, who is currently being prosecuted, had over 130 complaints filed against him before the incident that he got prosecuted for. Now, I'd venture to say that at some point in time, he would have went before for a state certification board if that was in place, and probably had been decertified long before he could have got to the incident for which he is being prosecuted for. So I think it's critical. It's a critical piece of legislation, and as long as it is implemented properly, we'll be able to see some level of police accountability that we've never seen before in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, no, I think it's worth saying, and and during our debate in the Senate, I said this on the floor, which is that, if those reforms, think about if those reforms had been in place a couple years ago, right, 5 years ago, the lives would have been saved in Springfield, and a lot of very awful and cruel incidents would have been prevented.
And a lot of money would have been saved
Yes.
in
5
lawsuits.
million, right? How much has it been? What's the figure?
Yeah, at least 5 million, and that's not counting the 6.5 million that was just paid out to someone who spent years in prison behind bogus police practices.
All right. So I want to, we've got a couple minutes. So I want to bring it down now to on a more personal level. You obviously have a lot of different roles that you play in the community, a kind of advocacy role, of course, through the NAACP, and you have your show and so many different things. But of course, one of your most foundational and most important roles is also as a minister and a leader of your congregation. And this has been such a hard time, especially for our houses of worship. Almost by definition, it's about gathering, it's about bringing people together, and it kind of strikes at the heart of what COVID has prevented. I actually was just thinking about it. I remember you and I talking on the phone when the shutdowns were first starting, and you pointed out to me that the shutdowns were going to mean that Easter services and Easter gatherings were going to be canceled. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, there's no way this is going to last until Easter.
Yeah,
and here we are.
Here we are going towards the second Easter.
Yeah, exactly. So can you just talk a little bit about, just on a personal level, what's that's been like for you, and also what it's been like for your congregation? How have you adapted? Where have the real challenges come into place? And maybe where some of the opportunities have come from some of the adaptations?
Yeah. It was very difficult in the beginning stages because, we were just used to doing church a certain kind of way. And all of a sudden we're faced with these restrictions. And there was a level of resistance at first because we're saying, wait a minute, now, if liquor stores are essential services and other places are essential services, then churches have to be essential services. But then when we realized the severity of the virus and how it was spread, it became critical that we be responsible toward our congregants and adapt a plan for our services that took their health and well-being into account. And so we had to restrict the gatherings in our churches and adapt to a new virtual world in which our congregants were viewing us virtually, and in which we were providing services in a very different and distinct way. And then also in which how we could receive revenue to continue to pay our bills and to thrive. Pre-COVID, 75 to 80% of our revenue came across the table in in-person services.
This is on Sundays, you mean, like in the service?
And so we, the concern was, well, what do we do? How do we change this? And now we're at a point now where probably 90% of our giving is given virtually. Through other means, and our people have been very faithful and have adapted to this new paradigm. It also has put us in a place where we have to be in touch with our people much more, because COVID is really striking at the heart, particularly of the Black community.
Yes.
Just in recent weeks, my wife has had COVID, my sister has had COVID, my mother has had COVID, my niece has had COVID. I've got various members of my congregation that have COVID. Got a text message before coming here that one of our church mothers is in the hospital with COVID. And so as a pastor, I've had to minister to the needs of these individuals that are suffering through this virus, to their family members. And unfortunately, I've had to preach funerals for people who have passed on because of COVID, and then counsel and comfort those families in the aftermath. We've engaged our community by providing personal protective equipment, by providing information to them on stopping the spread, by providing information on to those who own small businesses, et cetera, on PPP loans and how to access the stimulus of those types of things. So, I mean, it just runs the gamut in terms of how we've adapted and the changes in the level of services and kind of services that we have to provide in a COVID infested world that we did not have to be so concerned with prior to this time. And so it's challenged us to do ministry in a different way, to reprioritize those things that we do and to be more sensitive to the lives of those that we continue to serve.
Well, Bishop, that is about it. I think we're at the end of our time, but thank you so much for this. A lot of really urgent and important topics discussed, and hopefully the interview went smoothly with the table turned here. So
Sure. Absolutely.
After being a regular on your show, we've turned it around. So thank you so much, and everyone, please thank Bishop Talbert Swan. Just a reminder, this is available live streamed on Facebook and on Twitter, and is also available wherever you get your podcasts. And we're also on Focus Springfield TV as well. Bishop Swan, thank you so much and have a nice weekend.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye-bye.